Well, good evening to those of you in Europe. Good afternoon or even good morning if you're in the US. Thank you for joining us. We are really pleased to welcome you to the European Academy of Religions session on religion and politics. My name is Andrew Davis. I direct the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. And I'm going to be the question master stroke moderator this evening. So it's great to have you with us. We're really glad you could make it. Just a couple of technical things. So if you are new to the GoToMeeting platform and I'm sure over the last few weeks you've learned just about every kind of webinar platform going. This is perhaps one that's new to some of you. There is a control panel over on the side, and in that control panel you can tick a little box that says questions, I'll be keeping an eye on that and monitoring those questions. If there are things that you want to ask as the presenters are taking us through their papers, then just ask your questions there, and then at the end of the presentations we'll take all the questions together. So the format is going to be, I'm going to introduce Professor Cesari in just a moment, and then all the presenters will take 10 to 15 minutes to present their papers. And then we'll take the questions at the end of that and have some discussions. So it's great to have you with us. You're very welcome. This is the webinar on Is Religion the Blind Spot of Populism? And it's my very great pleasure to introduce the Professor of Religion and Politics at the University of Birmingham, Professor Jocelyne Cesari. Jocelyne, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for our colleagues, panelists, and also you colleagues in the audience. So this was supposed to be a live panel at the Bologna conference of the European Academy of Religion. Due to the circumstances, we have decided to move online, and I'm very happy that my colleagues who agreed initially to be in this panel have also agreed to be part of this webinar. So I'm going to introduce them. Then I'm going to present my own thoughts on the topic, and we're going to go through an order that was also maybe probably in the description of the panel you received. So besides myself, we're going to hear from Wolfgang Palaver with University of Innsbruck on fraternity versus parochialism, on religion and populism, Leon van den Broek from Kampen University on legislation and on religion and populist parties manifestos. On Tobias Kramer from the University of Oxford, the religious dimension of European and American populism compared, and our discussant will be Jeffrey Haynes from London Metropolitan University. So this will be the order of appearance on your screen. So just let me start by giving some very general remarks on why religion and populism. As you know, I mean, talking from a social science perspective or political science perspective, looking at religion and politics in general is already quite a challenge, although some efforts have been made in the last 2 decades. But when you come to religion and populism, the challenge is even bigger because nobody really agrees on what is populism. And this is the first obstacle that you can encounter. The second one is that for the people who have looked into religious populism or populism and religion, a lot of them, especially on the European, Latin American side, have been influenced by totalitarian regime like Stalinism, fascism, and they have looked at these movements as political religions rather than simply political movements. So lots of the current work associated with the revival of religious rhetorics in some of the populist movements have been heavily influenced by this kind of approach. The take that I have been adopting in my own work is slightly different. And it is in tune with a thread of scholarship that looks at populism, not trying to define a priori what populism is. And they are most of the time approached as political movements that have already defined themselves as populism. How? Because they refer to we the people. Right? Not all political movements will have this kind of approach of saying we are the people. So the moment a group or a political party adopt this rhetoric and the actions that go with it, that we can decide it's a populist movement. And I would say in the work I'm doing, I do the same with religion. And this is an ongoing discussion with both my colleagues in religion and in political science. We are few refusing to define a priori what is religion. We prefer to look at the way that some ideas are presented out there as religious. Some groups are presenting themselves as carrying some kind of religious marker, identities, or institutions that can be either defined or contested as religion. And we can all identify these kind of approaches in different contexts. So once we do not define a priori religion and populism, what does it leave us, so to speak? So there are some shared features of what are these people. How do you define yourself as we the people, as a populist movement? Lots of scholarship will agree that there are two main features in defining we the people. One is anti-elitism, meaning one of the common features across populist movement is to reject establishment and elites of all kinds, political, cultural, academic, mediatic. I mean, it can vary, but it's really anti-elite system. And the second shared feature is it's an exclusionary way of defining the people. And I think that's an important point to have in mind. It's always defining with the people against either another group, another people, in or out. It can be in or out. So this exclusionary way is also pretty much shared across the populist movement. But this makes a very thin shell, it's a very thin kind of definition, because then it can be invested either in, a right-wing movement, but also a left movement. And that's why we have to be clear here that there is not one particular ideology, including nationalism, that is automatically associated with populism. So having made this very broad kind of preliminary, how does it leave us? What does it mean? And from the analysis that I have been conducting here for a couple of years, there are things that come up very strongly in the way that how do people say we as a religious group, and how do people say we as the people, with the two characteristics I just mentioned, anti-elite and exclusionary. So there is a first way of being populist where the we the people and we the religious group line up. And you can have in mind lots of groups. Most of the populist movement today in Europe have, in the recent decades, created a sort of connection between we, the people of this particular nation, and we, the people of this particular religious group. And you have a lot of work that has been done on this particular type. So Brubaker, for example, has emphasized that populist parties in Europe are what he called national populist, because they define us versus them that play along two dimensions, what he called an horizontal dimension, meaning you are in or out on this horizontal dimension, and the outsiders usually belong to what the populists see as another threatening or dangerous culture, or in this case, civilization. And there have been a lot of scholarship looking at this civilizationism. I know it's not a very nice term, but that's what it reflects. The use of we, the people from this nation, are also the guardians of a certain type of civilization that is threatened by another civilization. And on the vertical dimension, the division is between the ordinary, hardworking, virtuous people and the corrupt, self-serving, out-of-touch elite. You can hear lots of rhetoric here. You know lots about the rhetoric that can fill into this description. So the populists in Western Europe and also in Eastern Europe have invested these two dimensions, horizontal and vertical, and nationalism is being redefined with more weight placed on civilizational differences. And religious tradition is part of this civilizational discourse, but it is not embraced as a praxis, but much more as an identity marker. So it is not a praxis, it is not a belief, it is an identity marker in direct opposition to Islam, in the case of Western Europe. And you have lots of work that has been done indeed on party manifestos, on interviews of the leadership of this movement that show that clearly it's not so much to be Christian that is invested, but to refer or solicit the Christian identity marker against Islam. What is more important is to define yourself against, but the belonging is there. So the belonging to the religious group, the religious people are also the national people, and we are all against this other that is threatening us. And in this respect, Islamophobia was not created by this kind of movement, but it has amplified and I would say facilitated their rhetoric. And here we see how this populist movement can also benefit from more mainstream kind of trends, either in popular or public opinion, but also in other political discourse. Islamophobia is not the monopoly of populist groups in Europe. It is also shared by other kind of groups, including secular leftist groups. And that's where you see interesting elements of this convergence between some reference to Christianity as a marker of the people and the nation, and also some reference to secular culture, part of the civilizational element. In other words, you can refer to secular or Christianity without ambiguity within this umbrella of civilizational identity against Islam. There is an interesting group that actually exists in France. As you know, the use of secular laicity or secularism or laicity has been central in also in the way of defining Islamophobia in countries like France, and it explains that there is this movement. Cannot remember right now the name, but it will come back maybe when we do the Q&A. And this group is defending laicity, but it's appealing to both the Christian groups around the National Front and also some leftist groups that are virulently anti-Islam because they defend the liberal values against the illiberal way of being religious and Muslim. So this is, I would say, one way of connecting with the religious people, with the national people. I would say America's share, of course, you can see in the Trumpism, if you want to call it this way, or populist call today in America, the same kind of reference to we the Christians, but it has a dimension that doesn't exist really in Europe, which is a more proactive way of being Christian. There is an interesting work that has been done measuring Christian nationalism in America. And so how do they define Christian nationalism? This is the work of Whitehead, Perry, and Baker. And they ask people, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. This is reverse coded, just to. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. If you ask Europeans this kind of question, even the populist one, they would probably say no. But the American populism are exactly defined by this kind of more proactive identification in the public space. So that's what I have called Christianity, not only as a marker of belonging, but Christianity as a public norm. Does it mean that people obliged by this public norm? Probably not. But it means that it's important for them that this assertiveness of being Christian and American is there. And I spare you all the details, but the survey shows that the more you agree with this kind of proactive way of being Christian, the more the probability you will adopt or identify to populist group. Trump is one of those, but I think there is this trend in American history also beyond Trump. So I don't know how many minutes I have left, but for me, coming from the study of Muslim countries, it did ring a bell with the way that Islamists have been looking at the way of defining the nations. For example, there is a lot of interesting work done now looking at the populist dimension of the AKP, Turkey, Erdogan, the party of Erdogan, and how the Islamists in Turkey have moved from we Turks are Muslims, which, by the way, was already there at the foundation of the modern secular Turkey by Kemalists, because Kemalist was also a populist movement. The moment you say we the people against another group, and in this case it was we the Turks against, you know, the West, and the temptation, the tentative to break down and make the Ottoman disappear. This was a populist movement by definition. What the AKP has added is a more like the Christian populist in America, a more proactive way, meaning it's not enough to say we belong, it's also important that we show in public space that we are Muslims. And it's all the debate on the dress code, the headscarf, the reintroduction of Islam in the public education, which was until the Kemalist period, under the Kemalist period, very much limited, and that has regained some kind of centrality. Does it mean that the Turks adopted? Probably not. But this idea that you are Turk not only because you belong, but also because you behave in some way or accept this Islam as public norm, is pretty much the grounded legitimacy of the AKP, I would say, until now. I think I have already passed my time. Before I conclude, I would say that there are some populist movements that also create this connection with a religious group, but beyond the nation. And you can look at some transnational Islamist movement claiming the Ummah in the same way. I have also looked, because this was interesting to me, to look at the way that some pan-Slavic group in modern Russia doing the same. You can see the emergence of we the Orthodox. It's not only Russia, it's also Ukraine or Belarus. And we are all together because we belong to this transnational Orthodox group. And it's fascinating here to see that the populism is not limited to the national borders. It can play within it, but it is not limited to it. And so this is the part of populism and religion that is not very much studied, actually. Most of the study deal with this collusion or conflation of religious belonging and national belonging. But there is a lot of work to be done on this more transnational connection of religion and people beyond national border. I will just close up with the ongoing discussion about populism and democracy. There is two ways. Some people would say it cannot be democratic because it's by definition anti-system. The responses from empirical surveys are much more nuanced than that. And the second one is the opposite. It's minority, but some people would say populists are the most democratic form of political movement today. Why? Because they appeal to the demos, to the people. And here I have some kind of objection. Appealing to the demos is not making you democratic. And this, for me, I have Aristotle backing me up right there. I say a long time ago that actually calling the demos can also be very demagogic. So again, no movement is a priori religious or populist, but populist movement cannot be defined right there as either anti or pro-democratic. So I will stop here and move on to Wolfgang Palaver.
Yeah,
Please,
I will reflect on the relationship between fraternity versus parochialism, but start with a reflection on religion and populism, and I can continue in some way what you said about the distinction between believing and belonging. I think that's my first point. The relationship between religion and populism is a complex one. So we can say, is religion directly responsible for parochial or nationalist outcomes? Or is religion just politically hijacked by populist leaders? And both these approaches are too simple. I also do not follow attempts to use the ambivalence of the sacred to understand the relationship between religion and populism, because then religion is turned into something obscure that cannot really be explained. And there is also a interesting development in a positive sense, that more and more religious leaders are separating themselves from populist leaders. We just recently saw the criticism, the real severe and harsh criticism Donald Trump got for his posing with the Bible in front of St. John's Church, or his visit to the St. John Paul II National Shrine. So the Episcopal Bishop Buddy and also the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, Wilton Gregory, criticized him severely. There are many other examples from Austria, my own country. We have the example of Vienna's Catholic Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, who expressed during a sermon in 2009 against the Austrian Freedom Party's use of the cross for anti-migration propaganda. He clearly emphasized that this contradicts the Christian call to love one's enemy. So church leaders are more and more emphasizing, or many church leaders or religious leaders are emphasizing faith and believing, whereas populists often focus just on identity and belonging. And so my main interest in reflecting on religion and populism is, what kind of religion do we have to understand to see what is supporting populism, what may be a religious element to be against populism, undermine populism. And for a couple of time, I'm focusing very much on the French philosopher Henri Bergson, especially on his late work, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, that he published in 1932. I think this book has to be read again, because it helps us to understand some of those difficulties, because Bergson so clearly said there are two very different types of religion. He distinguished between static religion on the one hand and dynamic religion on the other. And I think it's also anthropologically very important to see this distinction. One can also translate it into René Girard's distinction between the sacred, which would be the same as static religion, and the holy, which is much closer to dynamic religion. What is static religion or the sacred? It's a type of tribal religion that needs an outside enemy to strengthen internal cohesion. Anthropologically, it's characterized by pseudo-speciation or parochial altruism. It fights death anxiety and threats in general through a heightened group identity. The holy, on the contrary, is rooted in an individual mystical experience that trusts in immortality bestowed by a God of life. Bergson's understanding of mysticism, however, is a very special one, and we should not think about contemplation or leaving the world. His understanding of mysticism is an active mysticism, and he's thinking and referring to the Hebrew prophets in their fight for social justice. Exceptional people, he explained, like the sages of Greece, the prophets of Israel, the arahants of Buddhism, or the Christian saints have incarnated the holy, enabling the transformation of closed societies into an open society. According to Bergson, the dynamic religion culminates in Christ's Sermon on the Mount and is called to love our enemies. And out of this dynamic religion, out of this understanding of saintliness or holiness, he sees that there is a type of fraternity emphasized, which is neither instinctual or an abstract philosophical idea, but stems from the experience of those who share God's love for all human beings and the whole of creation. According to Bergson, fraternity is essential to sustain democracy because it reconciles liberty and equality. Fraternity is the most important but often neglected principle of the famous tripartite motto stemming from the French Revolution. Dynamic religion has not overcome, however, and this is the downside, but also helpful for our own time, dynamic religion has not overcome static religion forever. Bergson observed in 1932 or a little bit before, in between the two world wars, the reality of mixed religions when he reflected on the religious implications of the First World War, when he observed rightly that all the Christian parties involved in this war claimed to be in contact with a God common to all mankind, but behaved in this war like being connected to a national god of paganism. Many populist movements of today draw more strongly on elements of static religion and distance themselves from dynamic religion. For this reason, it's no surprise that populism represents a form of parochial altruism and is often characterized by xenophobia. Populists calling for a strengthened Christian identity in Europe, but also in the US, for instance, invoke Islam as its enemy to support their movements religiously. The real challenges, however, we face today do not need a return to the sacred or to static religion, but require a fraternal response to the corona pandemic, to the climate change, the threat of nuclear war, or the threat of social injustice. So in my final point, I want to give you 3 examples for religious attitudes close to dynamic religion, for religious attitudes that support fraternity. I start with a Catholic example or some Catholic examples, but then we'll move beyond Bergson by showing that we also find this approach among Muslim thinkers, and will finally end with Mahatma Gandhi, who is an example outside the Abrahamic religions also for this attitude of fraternity or this attitude of dynamic religion. So one of the students of Bergson, and I'm going to my Catholic examples, was Jacques Maritain, the Catholic philosopher. He was a student of Bergson. He had many problems with the ontology of Bergson, but he shared his emphasis on fraternity. And one of the students of Maritain, Robert Schuman, was one of the founding fathers of the European Union, who emphasized Christian fraternity to overcome hatred and to strengthen solidarity in Europe. And we are currently a little bit in danger to forget this foundational spirit of Europe. We can also look at Pope Francis, who is really a very strong supporter of fraternity. So if you look at his speeches and writings, you will see fraternity is emphasized again and again. In an interview, he underlined the fraternal beginnings of the European Union that were not shaped by populism. I quote the Pope: "When the great politicians of the post-war period, such as Schuman or Adenauer, dreamed of the unity of Europe, they were not preoccupied with anything populist, but with the fraternalizing of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals." In February 2019, Pope Francis signed with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, a document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. This was, from my point of view, an important initiative by two leaders of world religions to strengthen universal sister and brotherhood in a world where populists try to stoke up tensions between religions. And this is a good opportunity, and I'm really going beyond Bergson to come to my second example. And the second example is a Muslim philosopher, Suleiman Bachir Diané, a Senegalese philosopher teaching currently at Columbia University and Muslim, whose work shows his engagement with Bergson. He's a Bergsonian at its best. In an article on the future of religion in the 21st century, he criticized Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, typical example of static religion, with Huntington's static understanding of religion. Contrary to that, DNA favors a dynamic spirituality that enables dialogue and overcomes religious and cultural conflicts. And it's interesting, one of the thinkers on whom DNA focuses is Muhammad Iqbal, also a Bergsonian. He even met Bergson in Paris for one occasion. He's the spiritual father of Pakistan, and in his reconstruction of Islam, he emphasized again fraternity that goes beyond nationalism or imperialism. And my third and final example is Mahatma Gandhi, who as a Hindu does not belong to the realm of Abrahamic religions, but also emphasized the importance of universal fraternity. You can find in the writings of Gandhi also this distinction between static and dynamic religion, because he distinguished between institutional religions which are more in danger to become static and a religion that is beyond the narrow institutionalized versions of religion. Gandhi understood, again close to Bergson, that fraternity is an essential basis for every democracy. A recent article by Cristiano Cianolla shows how Gandhi's understanding of democracy can undermine populism. Gandhi overcame the populist use of religion through a spiritual understanding of democracy, with a moral discursive justification in truth as God, which is at odds with theocratic or religious fundamentalism. Close to the Sermon on the Mount, Gandhi understood, and he was referring in this quote to Muhammad Iqbal. He didn't like Iqbal's favoring of the two-state solution, but he emphasized with Iqbal, religions are not the source of hatred between human beings. It's just the other way around. Gandhi understood that to befriend the one who regards himself as your enemy is true religion. This quote expresses very well Gandhi's fraternal spirit. Fraternity, that's my final sentence, is essential for every democracy and an important antidote against its populist temptations. Thank you for being patiently listening to my paper.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Leon van der Broek, please.
Thank you. I hope Andrew can help me with the with share screening. Is Andrew still there, or? Yeah. Thank you.
Be.
Great, lovely. And then it should work, I hope. Yes. My focus in a part of my research is on party manifestos. A couple of years ago, I started with a couple of students to do research to keywords like religion, religious freedom, freedom of expression, etc. Not only to left-wing, but also right-wing parties, among others, also nationalist or populist parties. More recent, I focused more on Christian political parties in the Netherlands and how the keywords in their party manifestos are. So it's quite interesting also to look now more from an in-depth perspective to political parties who are more populist in nature, and to see how their party manifestos express their political and societal ideas and ideals for society and for the political domain. First of all, party manifestos are important sources for research because they express something about the coherence of their policy, and indeed indicate something about the significance of the party's desired electoral outcome. There are also two other functions of party manifestos: the internal focus, wanting to smooth over internal differences, and also an agenda setting focus, trying to help shape the broader agenda over which an election is fought. In 2014, Andrea Volkens and her colleagues published their book Mapping Policy Preferences from Text. One of the chapters is fascinating because it deals with the questions: what are manifestos for? Selecting and typing documents in the database. Manifestos do have a double face, and political parties, so also populist parties, have to make choices whether they address more the members of the political party and or address more on the voters. Party manifestos are ideal typical. They contain the ideal vision of the party for society. However, manifestos are not always applicable in the political arena and public life. Still, they provide a vision on, in their eyes, an almost perfect society. First, I take you along to the Party for Freedom of the politician Geert Wilders. His website, or the website of the party, does not contain a party manifesto. He does have a short party manifesto of just one page with the slogan, "The Netherlands back to us." That already highlights the political idea. It contains 11 main points, and a very first core point is against Islam and Islamization of the Netherlands. So the PVV wants to de-Islamize the Netherlands. It means zero refugees and no immigrants from Islamic countries. And it also means closing borders. More specific, the PVV wants to withdraw all the licenses to stay in the Netherlands for a certain period and also closing refugee centers. It means to forbid headscarves in the public functions, to forbid other Islamic expressions, which contradicts public order. Also to lock in radical Muslims for preventive reasons, you never know. And also to denaturalize criminals with a double identity or double passport and to expand them. And to not accept Syria travelers or warriors who want to return to the Netherlands. And finally, to close all mosques and Islamic schools and to prohibit the Quran. I was not able, because of lack of a bigger party manifesto, to do more research on the party manifesto of the PVV. A recent, not that old political party in the Netherlands is the Forum for Democracy of Thierry Baudet. His party manifesto says that adherents of religions need to respect the plurality of all worldviews, also of competing religion, of humanism and atheism, of critics, scientists and cartoonists. The freedom of expression has priority over the freedom of religion. And that is interesting because those populist politicians tend in the Netherlands also to be reluctant to Islam and to emphasize the Jewish Christian roots and nature of the Netherlands, whatever Jewish Christian might be in that specific combination. Now, the party manifesto of the Forum for Democracy contains 26 items about many things, but no specific item on religion. So we have to do more research on that and to see in every aspect where religion or religious notions might be found.
Mhm.
That is not only, and we tend to focus usually more on, let's say, right-wing political parties when it comes to populist parties. But of course, there are also more left populist parties. So it could be also like in many other countries, but also in the Netherlands, like the Socialistic Party, which has some tendency of or nature of being populist party when we focus especially on the word populist from populus in Latin. Now, the party manifesto of the Socialistic Party contains 20 items, and also no one is specific on religion or whatsoever. But if we dig in and if we compare the party manifestos of the Socialistic Party and of the Forum for Democracy, we see that, and of course I can only dig in the Dutch keywords, we see that a lot of specific religious words are missing, like christelijk, Christian, or Jew, Jewish, or synagogue, or church, or mosque. But there is some notion and more specific in the party manifesto of the Forum for Democracy when it comes to religion. So in Dutch, either religieus or godsdienstig, but also worldview, levensovertuiging, but not so much on Islam and not on mosque. Only a few references to niqab or burqa, and hardly any references to believe or believing, Also not so much on double passport in relation to religion, but the Socialistic Party, more than the Forum for Democracy, has a high score on security, and that's also fascinating, I guess. So this is work in progress. I'm busy to work that out more in depth, but this is just a small expression of the beautiful work on party manifestos, and also I'm trying to expand that and to do more research on party manifestos of European political, more specific populist parties. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Leon. And now we move on to Tobias Kramer. Please, Tobias, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. I think I just go without slides. Well, thank you so much. And as you already see from the title, I'm also looking at national populism, and I do in particular comparison between the situation in Western Europe and then the United States. And you've already actually set up a perfect introduction for me, so I don't need to describe the phenomenon itself. But really what I'm doing is looking at this paradox with, on the one hand, many national leaders and many national populist leaders being very open in their reference about Christian identity, from Trump in front of St. John's Church earlier this month to Pegida running around with oversized crosses in Dresden through the Front National and many, many others. But then at the same time, looking at some of the more complex or contradicting data points, such as that in spite of Trump being incredibly popular amongst white evangelicals, the very same evangelicals also said that they perceived him to be the least religious GOP candidate in recent history, that he was criticized by so many of white evangelical clergy, and that if we look to Europe, we actually see that national populist supporters tend to be on average significantly more secular than the average European. So if we take, for instance, Pegida, there were surveys showing that at the very demonstrations where they were running around with the oversized crosses, of these participants, over 75% self-identified as atheist or irreligious. And that we can see actually throughout Europe that very often things such as church attendance actually turn out to be a quite powerful predictor for not voting for national populist movements. So what I'm doing in my research is really trying to approach this question in 4 steps. First, looking at the social origins of national populism, then looking at how religion fits into this. What do national populists actually mean when they speak of Christian identity? That fits very much into what Jocelyne and Wolfgang have already said. And then third, really, how does this work out in practice? How do Christian communities react? In particular, what role do, on the one hand, political party alternatives play, and what role do Christian leaders play? And then fourth, what does this mean for the role of the church going forward? And I basically base this very much on research that I've done, fieldwork that I've done over the last 3 years, where I've interviewed over 120 national populist leaders, church leaders, and mainstream politicians in Germany, France, and the US, including most of the presidents of these national populist parties, members in the Trump campaign, the White House, as well as then the leadership of Protestant, Catholic, and evangelical churches in these 3 countries. But to the topic first, as I say, I look very much at the social roots of right-wing populism, and there my argument is very much that the rise of right-wing populism, and explicitly their reference to Christian identity, is to a large extent the consequence of the emergence of a new social cleavage centered around the question of identity, about how do we define the us, how do we define the other. So whereas for most of the 20th century our systems have been basically characterized by the 2 traditional cleavages, which is on the one hand the economic cleavage between the capitalists and the workers, the class struggle, so to speak, and on the other hand the moral or religious cleavage between social conservatives and social liberals, the culture wars, if you want to call it like that. We are increasingly seeing over the last couple of years that polls are showing that more and more identitarian issues such as immigration, national culture, national identity, increasingly trump economic, social, and moral issues, in particular as a priority, in particular among voters of national populist parties, which to an extent suggests that we might be actually witnessing a new social cleavage emerging, really centered around the question of identity, that really pits two visions of how do we define the us and the other against each other, with on the one hand a vision of a clearly defined national identity based on inherited group identity markers such as ethnicity, culture, history, authority, geography, and then on the other hand a more globalist idea that emphasizes universalism but also diversity, and that is much more focused on individualist forms of identity. So in Britain, you have people like David Goodhart calling this the divide between the somewheres and the anywheres that many of you will have heard of. Others are talking about nationalists and globalists, communitarians and cosmopolitans. There's a lot of debate about that at the moment. But what is really interesting is that national populists are really trying to tap into this new market niche by making national identity and immigration the centerpiece of their agenda. So to an extent, they are trying to create something of a white identity politics that is trying to reverse to an extent traditional identity politics of the left by saying we are defending the rights of the majority, so to speak, but trying to co-opt a lot of that same language. The question is then, of course, how does religion fit into this? And I very much agree with what, like, my findings very much agree with what Jocelyne and Wolfgang have already said, that national populists really try to employ Christianity primarily as a cultural, civilizational identity marker, and really primarily against Islam. They use Christian symbols, they use Christian language, but increasingly remain distant from Christian beliefs and values. It's very much this triangular relationship. It's an ex negativo definition of the us, primarily because the other is increasingly defined in religious terms as Muslim. So whereas maybe a couple of decades ago would have been the Turk or the Maghrebian, it's now very much the Muslim, and as a result, Christianity might appear as an analogous identifier of the us, but as we already mentioned, that is not necessarily a return of religiosity, but much rather a culturalization of the concept of religion. And I could see that very clearly in my own interviews, because one of the questions that I asked all of these leaders, these 120 leaders that I've spoken to, is how do you actually define Christian identity? And it was quite striking that not only clergy, but also most mainstream politicians I spoke to started talking about theology. They started talking about the Trinity, the resurrection, the second coming of Christ, sinfulness, etc. By contrast, almost all of the national populist leaders I talked to in all three countries started referencing cultural aspects, architecture, music, tradition, even geography, and crucially, almost all of them also started referencing Islam, really saying, we are Christian because we have a church in our village and not a mosque. We are Christian because we have Sundays off and not Fridays. We are Christian because we celebrate Christmas and not Ramadan. But really, we are Christian primarily because we aren't Muslim. And to just give you one or two example quotes, one member of the top leadership of the AfD in Germany in the Bundestag put it this way: in the AfD quote, in the AfD, the consensus is that when we say Christian or Occident, we mean it in historical and cultural terms rather than theological terms. It's about defending our culture against another civilization and the threat of Islam. A member of the Le Pen family similarly told me when I asked her about that, when I asked the person about that, that in the Front National, the religious question will necessarily be central, but it will be in relation to the question of political Islam. And perhaps in relation to political Islam, there will be a will to defend what defines us. And when it comes to defines us, well, then today it's hard to avoid Christian identity. But when I asked whether that is meant in any way religious, the person also said, no, this is really something very cultural. And actually, as I dug a bit deeper and really talked to more and more people in these parties, in the leadership of these parties, I even encountered very often reports about a very strong anti-Christian current in many of these movements. So one Christian in the AfD actually told me that again, quote, there are many people in the AfD who outwardly say that Christianity is extremely important to them and that they're Christian themselves, but who internally always fought the Christians in the party. They really wanted to destroy the Christians in the party. Christianity for them is really religion from the Near East, which does not fit into Germany. Another member of the leader of the Front National similarly told me that today there's a very strong secularist current in the Front National. Is a bit what Jocelyne already mentioned, so that very much confirmed that. So we really see this dynamic of Christianity being primarily defined as anti-Islam. So it then hopefully starts making sense to have them talking at the same time about laïcité, as well as about venerating Joan of Arc, about carrying crosses through secular Dresden, etc., and even starts to make sense to have a thrice divorced, formerly pro-choice businessman with relatively little exhibited biblical knowledge, but several alleged extramarital affairs, to become the savior of Christian America, if Christian America is really something cultural. Now, to be sure, the US is still a bit different, because the GOP is still seen by far as the more religious party, and even within the Trump administration, few would openly embrace a secularist stance similar to the positions that I mentioned just in the AfD or the Front National. But even in the US, you could see that it's not just the president's personal demeanor that undermined the Christian credentials of the Trump campaign, but really that, unlike earlier Republican candidates, the Trump really barely references Christian values and beliefs in his speeches. He really focuses on cultural identity issues in the war on Christmas, for instance. And there is also this new emergence, which is relatively new to the American sphere, of a strong Islamophobia, and really defining this external other in religious terms. We think about Sharia bans or the Muslim ban itself, etc. And one interesting development I also heard in my interviews a lot is that there's a growing number of officials in the Trump campaign who are saying that who told me that there's actually something of a clash between, on the one hand, all this faith advisory board, conservative Christians, and then on the other hand, people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller. So we are seeing similar dynamics of a more secular right clashing with a traditional Christian right in many ways. So starting from different levels, but we are seeing it developing in similar directions. Now the question is, of course, how this works out in practice, and you already mentioned a couple of surveys that are quite interesting, but it really seems that empirically, especially in Western Europe, it's really most successful, this sort of rhetoric, amongst non-practicing cultural Christians or even irreligious voters, whereas practicing Christians remain comparatively immune to that. So in the literature, you have people talking about religion gap or vaccination effect. And you see, for instance, in Germany, that the AfD scores almost twice as high amongst irreligious voters than amongst Protestants or Catholics. In France or Italy, it's similarly that historically the Front National or the Liga Nord have very much underperformed amongst Catholics, and even more so amongst regular church attenders. Again, in the United States, it's obviously very, very different, precisely because Trump did so extremely well. Amongst white evangelicals in 2016, the support continues to be relatively high. Yet interestingly, if you look a bit closer at the data, you can also see that during the primaries, he actually performed best among those evangelicals who never attend church. So there's a very strong negative correlation between church attendance and voting Trump, with those evangelicals who say they never attend church being most supportive, almost double as supportive as the most frequent churchgoers. So there's more and more possibility to speak, some social scientists speak of a schism amongst right-wing voters between, on the one hand, this traditional religious right, and then this new secular right. So religion really seems to be able to also empirically play into both ways, both as a fuel, but also potentially as a barrier to right-wing populism. And the last factor that I'm really looking at is then trying to understand what determines in which way it works. And there I find that two factors are particularly important. On the one hand, the behavior of the mainstream political parties, in particular the availability of a Christian alternative. So here's the logic very much that Christian voters in Europe, in particular, usually are already bound to a traditional conservative or Christian democratic party, and that for that reason, if this alternative is available, these voters are unavailable for the populist right. However, if such an alternative is lacking or taken over by a populist movement, as happened in the United States, then this religion gap breaks down to an extent. We saw that very clearly in the French presidential election of 2017, where initially this religion gap was very strong. Most Catholics voted for François Fillon, the conservative candidate. But once François Fillon and almost nobody voted for the Front National, which was almost double as strong amongst irreligious voters than amongst Catholics in the first round. But once Fillon was eliminated, that very much broke down, and many more Catholics started voting for Marine Le Pen because they perceived Macron as too secularist. And we could see similar dynamics, of course, in the United States, where in the primaries, as I said, church-attending Christians usually refrained from Trump, whereas in the general election, of course, they very much rallied behind him. But the second and perhaps even more overlooked factor that I find is really religion gap determined by the behavior of the institutional churches themselves. So we see that, for instance, in Germany, a lot of people would suggest, and data would suggest, that they've been actually able to create something of a social taboo around voting AfD, the church leadership, because really by positioning themselves clearly on the pro-immigration camp, demonstrating at AfD conferences, excluding AfD politicians from speaking at the National Church Day, the German churches really became some of the party's most robust public adversaries, and as a result, affection to the new right was very much associated with a significant social cost. And we can see similar dynamics in countries like France and Austria, where some scholars even speak of a Pope Francis effect. So whenever Pope Francis speaks out against immigration, against national populists or for immigration, we can see that amongst practicing Catholics, support for national populists goes down and support for immigration goes up, which goes in a similar direction. Interestingly, what I find in my interviews that is in the US, the leadership of most denominations, including white evangelicals, is actually similarly critical of Trump as in many Western European countries. Even many members of the Faith Advisory Council that I talked to were privately very, very critical and would rather take a position similar to that of something like Christianity Today. But the difference is that this skepticism does not translate into the same social taboo, and primarily that is for two reasons. On the one hand, you have, of course, the structural problem that it's not quite as hierarchical, so it is less clear and more contested in the US who speaks for Christianity. So you don't just have the president of the German Conference of Bishops and the president of the German Protestant Church who can say that, but in the US, because of the more decentralized system, it's much more easily contested. And then on the other hand, there's also a certain unwillingness to speak, on the one hand for fear of losing out influence with the White House, but also fear of losing followership in their congregations on the other hand. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I'll also leave it here. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the discussions on that.
Thank you, Tobias. And now I give the floor to Jeffrey Haynes for comments to all of us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's not usual to be a discussion without any papers, but on the other hand, all of your presentations were very clear and very well focused and very illuminating. So hopefully I can have a few thoughts. I won't go through each paper individually, if you don't mind, because I think they were on quite different topics, although there were certain commonalities which I think were obvious and clear, which I'd like to just draw on, I suppose. The first one really is the very first thing that Jocelyne introduced with, which was to say, what is populism? And I know we're all aware of this kind of minimalist two-pronged definition, which is basically anti-elite, anti the establishment on one hand, and also an exclusionary way of focusing political appeals. And I think this is true, but I also wonder whether it's very helpful for us to try to distinguish populist from non-populist parties at the current conjuncture, really, because it seems to me that the circumstances that we all live in, circumstances around the world, influence politicians to behave in a way which we can label populist. So I think one real problem is finding out what in an analytical and to some degree ideological sense, what populism means for our understanding of the political world. And I think that the useful examples which Jocelyne referred to, Trump, of course, Turkey with Erdogan, the notion of a transnational populism, which I suppose is a way of thinking about the EuARe. Whether it would be a entirely appropriate one is another matter. But very interesting thoughts raised by Jocelyne at the commencement, I think. Wolfgang talking about Henri Bergson, someone I don't know very much about, so I won't try to engage on that particular issue. But it did strike me that the issue of Christian identity and Islamophobia also occurred from what Wolfgang was saying, as he did in Jocelyne's presentation. And I think all of the populist examples which were covered, with the exception of Turkey, do feature a focus on Islam as a negative force. Whether this implies that religion is the issue, or whether it implies, as several of the presentations suggested, it's more about culture and perhaps by extension civilization. One of the key attributes of most Western European countries, if not all Western European countries, of course, is that they are very secular. And depending on what data you believe, the US is also going down a strongly secularist route now. And I know that we hear a lot about what I would call the Christian right. But I mean, as the Black Lives Matter protests have shown in recent days, not all Americans are completely enamored with that approach. So I think there's an issue here which means that populist parties seek to exploit the social fragmentation and concerns raised partly by secularization, partly by globalization, partly by the global crises which we're all aware of. And these can make people, I think, strongly in favor of ideas and political programs which seem to them to bring back some security that they feel has gone. Certainly Trump is an epitome of that, I think. He was someone who was going to bring the jobs back to the Rust Belt. He was someone who was going to bring American jobs back to America, having been stolen by the Chinese, of course. So I think that populism is largely a defensive mechanism for seeking to rectify what are perceived concerns with the present. The other issue is, and Leon, I think, made this clear in his paper, that manifestos, particularly in the Netherlands, which is, of course, is a highly secular country, don't necessarily refer to religion. I think that is self-evident that this is because secularization and the process of secularization and the results of secularization don't value religion as a political value. And it makes sense to talk about something we dislike, Islam, something we dislike, immigration, as a way of focusing upon religion without actually implying that religion is the issue. Moving on to Tobias. Well, great to hear your PhD in 10 minutes. Sounds fantastic. Hats off to you with your 120 interviews. It must have been really, really interesting. I hope at some stage I can talk to you about this personally. Yeah, I think it's a very useful comparison to make between Western Europe and the US. I've looked at both areas more on the US now than on Western Europe, but it seems to me that there are cultural, historical, traditional, various factors which are unique to individual countries, which help to make populism take on the cultural components of those particular environments. The US, of course, is a country which has seen populism over the years. Andrew Jackson, of course, is the famous example which who Trump is often likened to. To some degree, I think religion is something of an empty signifier in these circumstances, partly because in Western Europe, these are very secular societies, and really religion doesn't mean very much, I think, unless it is in the context of an anti-Islam, even Islamophobic view of the world. In the US, of course, this is always been the outlier in the secularization story. modernization equals secularization equals decline of religion in the public realm. Not in the US. But I think, as Tobias pointed out, the very word Christianity has a number of meanings in the United States. Traditionally and historically in Europe, of course, it was the Protestant Catholic division, which was primary and led, of course, to the wars and the conflicts, which we're all aware of in the fairly recent historical past. But in the US was, of course, the place where mostly Protestants fled from persecution. And I think that this is something which informs the Christianized worldview of many of Trump's supporters. They feel persecuted again. They feel they've lost something which they had. They feel that the world's out to get them, that the immigrants are out to get them. And I think the Christian right has been very politically skillful in using metaphors about Christianity to highlight wider concerns with identity and wider concerns with the place of largely white Protestants, white conservative Protestants in the status quo. We all know that 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump. We also should be aware that most of those evangelicals are white Christians. And I think the two go together very, very well. Tobias mentioned also Stephen Miller, who many of you will know is a white supremacist who writes Trump's speeches about immigration. And I think there's nothing which makes the two views incompatible in the United States when it comes to populism. They reinforce each other, they draw on each other, and they make the message of Trump stronger than it might be if he just focused on religion or if he just focused on secular issues. So for me, this has been a very interesting and informative hour or so. I feel that I have said enough, and I'll be glad to hear any questions that people have to the panel and to hear what you have to say. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. So we can go a few ways differently. We can, if you want, respond directly to Jeff for a few minutes, so we can take on the questions. My preference would be to take on the questions, and you can also, within your positions, also respond to Jeff. So, Andrew, I have a few questions written here. That's what I should go through.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So there are interesting questions here. Someone mentioned, indeed, we have been very much focusing on what Wolfgang calls the Abrahamic religion. Although we have one question mentioned pagan nationalism. I didn't mention it, but you can also look at the Hindu movement, Hinduist movement today, Hinduist movement or nationalist movement as also a popular movement, trying to create this connection between being Hindu and being an Indian. So you can find this kind of conflation across all religious tradition. It is not specifically Abrahamic, unlike what people think. It is about what my religious groups say about the collective national community or international community to which I believe or I belong. And this is not specific to the monotheistic traditions, I think. The same person mentioned religious Zionism. Absolutely, that's the same logic. Is anybody willing to add to that? Because before I move to another remark, no. There is a question that I found very intriguing, but I'm not sure I can respond to it. Or maybe some of you could. It's about populists being gnostic. So I'm going to turn to the scholar of religion here, Wolfgang or Leon. What do you think of that? There is this remark that populists agnostic. I'm not sure exactly what the person meant by that, but what do you make of that?
I cannot make a lot out of that. I mean, Gnostic is also a broad term. Immediately, Eric Voegelin's work comes to my mind, but I would have difficulties to really relate populism to Gnostic movements. I would like to add just something to the question before about Hindu nationalism or nationalisms or national populist movements in other religious tradition, because the term of Bergson that I mentioned, static religion, that is something prior to axial religions in some way. So anthropologically, and that's the interesting thing about the work of Bergson, he connects very closely to evolutionary theory. And he would say the first impulse coming from nature is more leaning to a small group who is against other groups. So this parochial attitude is something deeply rooted in nature. And it's not so easy to go beyond it. So his book is a criticism of idealist philosophy who can think you can just move quickly to cosmopolitan attitude. And we see today it's not possible. In times of crisis, the old pattern comes back very strongly. But the interesting thing about him is that he also sees the overcoming of this pagan, deeply rooted parochial pattern is also connected to nature. So he says both static and dynamic religion are related to nature, but dynamic religion goes to a deeper, more dynamic nature. So he makes the famous distinction that the parochial patterns are natura naturata, so when nature became fixed and static, whereas dynamic religion goes back to what is called natura naturans, so the élan vital that was so important in the work of Bergson. So what I would say, it's in all the religions, and it's not a surprise that if you look at Christian thinkers, the one I studied most closely is Carl Schmitt, who is one of the theoreticians who is influencing at least partly populist groups. His type of Christianity is a very pagan type of Christianity. In one of his works, he even said, pagan Christianity is the good Christianity, and Judeo-Christianity connecting to the prophetic legacy in Judaism. This is dangerous. And I think this is a very important and a key insight. I just side with the other side. I think the Judeo-Christian legacy is very close to what we see in all the axial religions, whereas the pagan Christianity is the older pattern of this leaning towards closures.
Thank you. Any take on that? Then there is a question on the more psychological aspect of populism. This is a fascinating dimension that I don't know, I have not touched on it particularly. But the question is about, if I summarize, it's more fundamentally a social psychology and neuroprocessing issue rather than a religious or political one. I'm not sure I would disconnect psychology from religious and politics, but it seems to me that it talks more, Wolfgang, to your vision of the two, religious static versus dynamic, you know. It's like also when you are that type of psychology that are more open to one type than another. And again, Bergson could maybe lead you in this direction. So if you want to say something about that, Wolfgang.
Can you repeat the question? The question itself? Yeah.
If I summarize, the question isn't more fundamentally a social psychology and neuroprocessing issue rather than a religious or political one.
I would not separate those issues. So a very close friend of Bergson was William James, who had a very strong psychological view of religion, and he understood the work of Bergson very closely. And Bergson also, he's not so much focusing on religion as religion, because he quickly shows what are the political implications. So the famous Popperian distinction between closed societies and open society goes back to Bergson, and I think the Bergsonian version is much deeper and more profound, because he shows the psychological, the religious, and social dimensions. We should also not forget that Bergson's work has to be read against the background of Durkheim. And Durkheim said the religious and the social is the same. And Bergson agrees in regard to static religion. He says Durkheim is absolutely right. So the first 100 pages of Bergson's book is confirming Durkheim. But the title of his book, that there are two sources of morality and religion, shows Durkheim is right in regard to static religion. Durkheim has not understood dynamic or even seen dynamic religion at all. So therefore, that's also a proof that you cannot separate the social and the religious easily. Although we have to distinguish, but first of all, we have to understand how deeply they are connected. So in static religion, morality is supported by group pressure, and that's also something we can observe in social life, but also in populist movements and populist campaigns.
Thank you. Anyone else on that?
I mean,
maybe
very briefly, because I think that's actually a very interesting point, maybe not just on populism itself, but as I mentioned, one of the things that really came out in a lot of the interviews was that one of the key explanatory variables why many church-going Christians, at least in Western Europe, don't vote right-wing populism is not necessarily because they disagree with, or they are more or less right-wing populist than their secular neighbors in terms of attitudes. Actually, in attitudes, there's not much difference. But they seem to be very sensitive to social taboos, and whether that is because it makes you more like sensitive to that if you are in a church, or if people who are more sensitive to social taboos go to church more, etc. But it seems to be a very important factor in that people are saying there's actually a gap of attitudes and behavior, especially amongst church-going Christians in Western Europe, that you don't have to the same extent in more secular parts of the population. So I think this socio-psychological factor does go into that, the social pressure in this part of the equation as well.
Thank you. Then there is a question based on what we said about religion being in Europe an identity marker against Islam. I think we all agreed on that. And the question is about another common marker, gender. And it is particularly specific to religious populists to also have gender as an identity marker. I would say here I would draw the difference between Europe and America. It may be the case in America, I'm not sure it's clear in Europe. So would you, any of you, Tobias, maybe worked on both sides, what could we say about gender?
I think that is a big distinction between the two, because you do have in Western Europe, especially if you look at somebody like something like the Front National, with especially Marine Le Pen, really saying we are the real defenders of women's rights against Islam. We are the real defenders of gay rights against Islam. You see similar developments. I think Leon could talk to that in the Netherlands, as you mentioned, where they're really saying we are the real progressives in terms of feminism, and you have similar developments in Germany as well. In the US, obviously, that is not quite there, because it is traditionally so much more conservative. I also noticed in my interviews I would get significantly fewer women to interview in the far right in the United States. Nonetheless, you can see certain inklings of that. So it was quite interesting when Trump justified his Muslim ban. He did say rhetoric that we would usually see in Europe about we don't want Islam, we want our women to be allowed to do whatever they want, and we want to and he defended basically the gay LGBT community because it was after this attack on the gay club in Orlando. And a lot of the people on his faith advisory board I talked to actually said like the one thing where they are quite not that happy with Trump is that he is like doesn't really care at least that much about LGBT issues, gay and gay marriage, etc. And I assume that he's probably similar. He's obviously not supportive, but he's also not quite as outspoken against it as many traditional Christian right leaders might have been. So we see inklings, obviously a very different level to Europe, but I think there are certain beginnings.
Jeff?
I think we need to remember that Trump is a very shallow vessel, and he will say almost anything which he thinks will get him votes. And I think that the allusion to the gay club and the kind of the sort of Wilders approach, which is, you know, that the Muslims are out to get us, and one of our values is about the equality of gay rights. I just don't think that's anything more than rhetoric. I mean, all of Trump's faith council and other people who are close to him, like Tony Perkins, etc., are vociferating. They're just like gay rights and of equality of marriage and so on. So I think we need to keep in mind that populists, like any other politician, will say whatever they think will be appropriate to win votes. I don't think that we can refer to Trump as an ideologue of any description whatsoever, and I think that he will say what he needs to say to win votes. And it is also very well worth bearing in mind that Trump's support base is made up of secular people too. It's not only Christians that go for him at all. It's secular, or what I would call secular, people who are culturally Christian. They may even go to church once in the blue moon, but Christian values, for whatever they are, play no real role in their lives. So I think that gay rights has a specific role in Europe, in some European countries, especially in the Netherlands, which in the United States I think is much more difficult to pin down as an attribute of Donald Trump's populism.
I mean,
oh, sorry, Wolfgang. Yes.
Just an observation from Austria. There it's interesting that the most populist parties are strongly supported by men, so they are much higher male voters than female voters. So they are in some way also a male party, but at the same time they use the woman question against Islam, which is sometimes very funny to observe that a party who has really problems to have women in higher ranks of politics, and at the same time now strongly attacking Islam for being too male dominated. So this is, I think, in some European countries, and especially in the more traditional Catholic countries where there is this gender gap, you see very paradoxical relations to the gender question.
Yes, Leon?
Yes, thank you. I would like to support that because I noticed also that, well, as far as it goes for the Netherlands, mainly the populist parties are led by men, and whereas they use, for example, Islam, and just like Wolfgang said, they use the women in the passive role. They put them in the passive role, as let's say they have no choice. They are the victims to have to wear headscarves or whatsoever, or stay at home. So they make also a certain picture of the Islamic women, whereas they do not pay attention too much or honor the other types or the variety of women in Islam, whatever country that may be. So this gives rise also to the thought not only of the view of men belonging or as leaders of populist parties, but also the relationship and the contradiction or the resemblance of female leadership, both in populist parties and or in religious or faith communities. Because Wolfgang just lectured on static and dynamic religion, forgive me. And I was thinking also that goes for the sociological point of view, but also from the psychological point of view. And what does that mean for the competence of the leadership of both political leaders and also religious leaders in faith communities, where there is a strong emphasis on the personal leadership and the personal competences, much to the decline of the professional competitors, for example.
Yes, thank you. So it seems that you all have pretty much the complexity of this gender question, because there was a remark that was not in agreement with our initial statement that European populist parties stand for women's rights against patriarchal Islam. And so the pushback was, at the same time, they defend the patriarchal social order and family ideals. So I think we show this kind of complexity or contradiction, right? And I would say that's what makes them so attractive, because we have to look at them from both perspectives, either the supply demand or the supply aspect or the demand aspect, you know. So it's very easy when you say we the people, it's much better to define yourself against something that to clearly identifying what makes you the people, you know. That's easier to say I'm against Islam without really clarifying what this means within. And to go, if I may have one remark for Leon's results on the paucity or the very little mention to religion in the manifestos. It seems that it is a European feature. It's not only the Netherlands. There have been other studies I'm happy to share with you that show that actually there are very little references to religion, to Christianity in particular, and every kind of reference is against Islam without automatically saying what this means exactly in terms of religion. So again, it goes back also to what Tobias was saying, and if I can summarize this, I liked it very much. I don't know if I wrote it as my own, but it's like, it's not so much to be Christian, it's we don't want Islam. So it's more about being without Islam than being with Christianity, if I can say that. So it's a very kind of specific position here. And that's why if you are religious, it doesn't make you automatically a populist. And this is also true in the US, I would say. It's the moment you use your religion as an exclusionary marker that you become a religious populist. And you can be nationalist without being populist. It's the moment you use your national community as an exclusionary marker that you become a populist. And this goes back to your remark, Jeff, about, yeah, this is very limited. I agree. These two, the exclusionary and anti-system, are very limited, but they work well if you look at how religion plays into that. So because there is a tendency, I live in the US now, to see that religious people are intolerant, or people who claim national identities, this is more European, are also intolerant. Today, the boundaries have been pretty much blurred. It's how do you define we, the people, in an exclusionary term, and it can vary. So it's neither or, you know, neither nor. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Jocelyne, for your remark, and also Jeff, when it comes to almost the absence of religious notions in party manifestos. At the same time, it's in a way a bit surprising, because when you hear those populist leaders talking for national camera or for the radio, they never are shy to state over and over again the Judeo-Christian nature, whatever that may be again, of the Netherlands or whatever country, in order to exclude Islam, Muslims, or whatsoever. So one could easily expect that there would be some more reference to religion. It's not so much surprising that it's absent, so to speak, in the party manifesto of left-wing political parties. But when we hear those right-wing populist leaders talking, they are never shy to demonstrate how, in our case, the Netherlands is or was Judeo-Christian, so that's not Islamic. And of course, you can say, in one sense, in front, one would expect that it would be more prominent in some keywords in manifestos.
If someone wants also to follow up on Leon before I move to the next comments or question? No. So very simple questions. What makes a populist a populist? So my take has been the group that say it doesn't have to be a party. It can be a party, but it can also be a social movement. It can say we the people, and the people is defined in an exclusionary way against the other and against all type of elite or political system or established political system. This would make for me a populist, but maybe others have other. Tobias, you say something?
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously tons and tons of different definitions and approaches to populism. That many different definitions, but like the classic definition would the thin ideology, so to speak, is the elite and the pure people, and that especially right-wing populism is this triangular view, where it's the pure us and then the set of two others, the internal other, the external other. And that can attach itself to different forms of, as we see. I mean, I think that was actually great debate talking there about the dynamics about gender issues and Christianity. I actually think Boubacar does mention that, for instance, that it's part of the same civilizationism. And I think, Jeff, you yourself have written on this. It's like, it's actually parallel to an extent, that these things can be attached to this triangular worldview. So there might be just as little defenders of the Christian Occident in the Netherlands as they are defenders of gender rights in the US, which doesn't stop them from referencing that. But maybe one last point on who is a populist. That is becoming, at least because for my research was, of course, difficult to find, like, how do you define a populist, etc. It is becoming more easy to the extent that more and more right-wing populist leaders now self-identify as such. And in this respect, Steve Bannon has done many of us a great service when it comes to at least different definition problems, because he has said, we are national populists. We have this transnational national populist movement. He has created the Judeo-Christian Academy of the West that was based in Italy. I think it's bankrupt by now. But this, they self-identify as such. So that is a big advantage, and because he has created that, that makes it, at least in Western democracies, easier to say, well, you are a national populist or right-wing populist because you identify yourself in that way, because it's becoming a transnational movement in some ways.
Any other take on that? On populists? I mean, again, here's I would say the contextualization is key. And it's interesting, the more I have looked into this new conjunction, religion and populism, the more I can say that a lot of Islamist movement could be defined as populist by these two features. You know, they have a vision of we the people, we are all Muslims, what should define our nation is our Islamic belonging, but also our Islamic practice against the secular establishment. And again, what is very striking in the case of the AKP, especially in its first phase, was to say we are the people against the Kemalist secular establishment, and it worked well. What is even more fascinating is that the AKP has been in power for several years now, and the people are still, the people when you interview them are still sharing this vision. We are the people and we need to be defended. So there is something in there that go back to the question of the psychology, you know, because if you look at the rhetoric, the populist rhetoric of Erdogan, it moved away from secular versus Islam to more like us, Turks, against the West. And the difference is not only external, it's also internal. Any kind of opposition movement in Turkey today that will challenge the power of the AKP will be defined or described as a pro-Western kind of movement. So this is very interesting to see how it shifts, you know, according to the new political circumstances. Yeah. I think I don't have any more questions here. So unless I get one in the next minute, and unless all my colleagues here want to speak a few last words. No, I think we've done very well, because I was told that on this kind of session, the maximum we can do is an hour, and we are at almost 2 hours. So I will thank all of you for participating, and also all the members of our audience who have been very loyal and up to the end of this session. And so the session is recorded for the one who could not attend all or part of it. And we see you maybe in real life sometime, somewhere on this topic. Thank you all.
Thank you,
thank you, Andrew, also for being our maître de cérémonie. Bye-bye. Bye all.